They stayed up all night. Not because they had to, but because they believed something historic was about to happen. In the dark corners of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, young people gathered in circles, lighting fires, chanting slogans, and painting posters that simply read, "Our hero. Our leader." Their faces glowed not just from the flames, but from hope. Something was shifting, something powerful, something irreversible. On the walls of government buildings, graffiti shouted the name, Traore. In marketplaces, people whispered stories of defiance. Across social media, the image of a soldier in uniform, young, determined, eyes fierce with purpose, was going viral. And then, as the first rays of morning sunlight touched the streets, the world turned its eyes toward one room, the presidential palace, where an unprecedented showdown was set to unfold. The Western media had already framed the narrative. CNN International called Traore a populist provocateur. BBC World Service warned that economic disaster is imminent. The Financial Times didn't hold back. Burkina Faso commits economic suicide, they claimed. But on the ground, African media told another story, one of a leader standing up not only for his country, but for a continent. Inside the palace, the clock was ticking. The 24-hour deadline Traore had given to World Bank Director Morrison was about to expire. And when the meeting began, with journalists broadcasting it live, the world watched in disbelief. What happened in the next few minutes would ripple across global markets, shake governments, and inspire millions. This is not just a political drama. It's not just the tale of a young African president defying a global institution. This is the beginning of a new chapter in history. The story of how one arrest shook the foundations of the financial world, and awakened a continent long silenced. For weeks, the negotiations had stalled. Behind closed doors, Burkina Faso's new leadership had demanded something that international financial institutions had never seriously considered: full cancellation of the national debt. Not restructuring. Not partial forgiveness. Cancellation. And not just that, they demanded the return of $23 billion in stolen wealth, funneled out of the country through decades of shady contracts, rigged deals, and puppet regimes. The man caught in the middle of it all was Richard Morrison, a career economist, a director at the World Bank with a long resume and carefully chosen words. When he arrived in Ouagadougou, he believed it was just another tough meeting. A few firm statements. Some promises. A handshake for the cameras. He couldn't have been more wrong. Traore gave him 24 hours. Either the World Bank agreed to cancel Burkina Faso's debt and begin the process of returning the stolen wealth, or there would be consequences. At first, Morrison didn't take the threat seriously. He made some calls to headquarters. He reassured his team. He gave a press statement urging calm and diplomacy. But as the hours ticked by, something began to change. Western embassies started issuing evacuation notices. Social media filled with live videos of protests swelling in major cities across West Africa. Chants of "No more chains" echoed through the streets. And Morrison began to realize, this wasn't just posturing. This was real. By dawn, the world's media had set up outside the presidential compound. Cameras were rolling. Drones circled overhead. Inside, Morrison walked into the meeting room, escorted by Traore's security team. The young leader stood waiting, calm, collected, eyes fixed forward. The dialogue that followed would become one of the most replayed exchanges in African political history. Morrison began with a shaky voice. "I spoke with Washington," he said. "They're willing to restructure the debt. A 50% reduction is possible." Traore didn't blink. "I'm not asking for restructuring," he replied. I'm demanding cancellation. And the return of the $23 billion stolen from my people. Morrison's voice faltered. That's impossible. The World Bank doesn't have that kind of authority. What happened next stunned the world. Traore stood, nodded to his guards, and said calmly, "Then you are under arrest, Mr. Morrison. You will be tried for economic war crimes." Gasps filled the room. Morrison protested, shouting, "I have diplomatic immunity." But Traore's reply echoed through every news feed and every social media clip that followed: "Those who commit genocide have no immunity." In moments, Morrison was handcuffed. His team, 5 World Bank officials, were also detained. The footage, raw, shocking, and historic, was streamed live. Around the world, phones buzzed. Investors panicked. Financial institutions froze assets. The World Bank stock value plummeted by 12% in a single day. Western banks operating across Africa triggered emergency protocols. But inside Burkina Faso, it was celebration. Crowds poured into the streets. Church bells rang. Mosques called special prayers. Market vendors cheered. "We kicked out the World Bank," they shouted. And in schools, children were already drawing pictures of Traore in their notebooks. The arrest marked not just a symbolic gesture, it was a declaration of war on a system that had held Africa down for generations. In that single act of defiance, Traore didn't just change the fate of one nation. He opened a door that could reshape the entire continent. Within hours of the arrest, the world began to react. The footage of Morrison being handcuffed and led out of the palace was impossible to ignore. Though many major Western media outlets initially avoided showing the images, they spread like wildfire across social media. On TikTok, clips of Traore's speech were edited with drums and traditional chants. On X, formerly Twitter, the hashtag #AfricaAwakens trended for 48 hours straight. Millions of young Africans were watching, sharing, celebrating. In global markets, the impact was immediate. World Bank bonds dipped sharply. Investment funds tied to African assets went into free fall. Commodity prices swung wildly, especially gold and uranium, 2 of Burkina Faso's most important exports. Wall Street analysts scrambled to assess the damage, while African financial experts coined a new term to describe the shock: the Traore effect. But in Burkina Faso, the mood was the exact opposite. It was as if the country had just won a war. At noon, President Traore addressed a crowd of over 100,000 people gathered in Thomas Sankara Square, a name chosen to honor the revolutionary leader who decades earlier had tried to break the country free from neocolonialism. This time, his spirit seemed to be alive again. Standing on a simple wooden stage, surrounded by elders, students, and soldiers, Traore's voice rang clear. "Dear brothers and sisters, today we declare our true independence. No one will rob us anymore. Our wealth is ours. Our gold is ours. Our uranium is ours. And we will use these for the welfare of our people, not for foreign banks." The crowd roared. Women ululated, waving the national flag. Young girls performed traditional dances. The elderly, some with tears in their eyes, raised their hands in prayer. It wasn't just a speech, it was a rebirth. Throughout the country, celebrations erupted. In villages, people lit fires and sang freedom songs late into the night. In schools, children recited Traore's quotes instead of textbook definitions. Market vendors changed the names of their stalls to things like Independence Fruits and No More Debt Cafe. Artists began painting murals on public walls, images of chains breaking, birds flying free, and portraits of Traore dressed in military green, fist raised toward the sky. Outside Burkina Faso, the shockwave continued. In Ivory Coast, protests broke out calling for the cancellation of World Bank agreements. In Ghana, university students organized marches demanding their leaders follow Traoré's path. In Senegal, civil society leaders began planning a sovereignty summit. What had started in Ouagadougou was spreading across borders like wildfire. International responses started flooding in. From South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa offered public praise. Traoré has reminded the world that Africa still has lions, he said. In Brazil, President Lula da Silva declared solidarity, calling for a joint struggle against financial imperialism. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi stated that Africa's rightful demands must be heard. In the streets of Paris and Marseille, thousands from the African diaspora organized vigils and marches, waving flags, holding signs that read, "Justice for Africa," and, "One banker down, more to go." In U.S. politics, progressive lawmakers like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders voiced support. Even a few conservative voices joined in. Republican Senator Rand Paul questioned whether U.S. foreign aid should continue funding institutions like the World Bank. And yet, while the world debated and markets trembled, one thing became clear: something irreversible had happened. Traoré's act had pierced the armor of an institution long seen as untouchable. For many Africans, it wasn't just about the debt, it was about dignity. It was about finally being heard. And as the celebrations continued into the night, with fireworks lighting the sky and choirs singing in city squares, a single question lingered on everyone's mind. If one nation could do this, who's next? The arrest of Morrison didn't just shock the world, it lit a match under a continent long kept in economic chains. Within days, what started as a single act of defiance in Burkina Faso triggered a domino effect that even the most optimistic revolutionaries hadn't dared to imagine. In Ivory Coast, thousands of young people marched through the streets of Abidjan waving hand-painted banners reading, "Traoré showed us the way." University students occupied campus buildings, demanding their government sever all ties with the World Bank and launch an audit of all foreign-backed projects. Protesters chanted, "No more debt. No more theft." In Ghana, student unions from 5 major universities coordinated a mass protest called Independence Week, where lectures were replaced with teach-ins about neocolonialism, global finance, and African sovereignty. Guest speakers included local economists, historians, and even former government officials who now felt emboldened to speak out. In Senegal, a coalition of youth groups, artists, and human rights organizations announced the formation of the Sovereignty Alliance. Their first demand, a full review of all international financial agreements signed since independence. "This is our Sankara moment," one organizer said on national television. "We will no longer be pawns in someone else's game." Even in countries not yet touched by mass mobilization, conversations began changing. On talk shows in Nigeria, panelists debated whether the country should follow Burkina Faso's lead. On radio stations in Kenya, callers asked why their government still depended on Western loans when their natural resources were being exported at bargain prices. The question wasn't if change was coming, it was how fast, and how deep. Meanwhile, African leaders faced mounting pressure. Those with reformist leanings quickly positioned themselves as allies of the New Africa movement. The president of Mali issued a statement praising Traoré's courage and calling for regional solidarity. The leader of Chad announced an emergency cabinet meeting to reevaluate national debt strategy. Rumors swirled that high-level discussions were taking place across the African Union. The shockwaves even reached the diaspora. In France, African youth rallied outside embassies and consulates, waving flags of Burkina Faso and playing drums through the night. In Canada, young activists held vigils and open mic nights where poets recited verses dedicated to Africa's new dawn. Across the globe, a generation raised on economic inequality and cultural erasure was finding its voice. International observers coined it the African Spring, though many Africans rejected the term. This wasn't a sudden outburst. It wasn't inspired from outside. It was a long-buried truth finally erupting after decades of suppression. Traoré's single move had done more than challenge a financial institution. It challenged a worldview. It reminded millions that they were not powerless. That sovereignty wasn't a myth. That a different Africa, proud, self-reliant, unbought, was not only possible, but already emerging. And as more countries debated following Burkina Faso's lead, one thing became clear: this was no longer just about one nation or one leader. It was about reclaiming a continent's future. What made the arrest of Morrison even more explosive wasn't just the boldness of the act, it was what followed. Hours after his detention, Burkina Faso's National Intelligence Service raided the residence and office space occupied by the World Bank delegation. What they discovered sent shockwaves far beyond the borders of the country. Inside Morrison's encrypted laptop were thousands of internal documents, emails, and confidential memos. Within 48 hours, a special investigative unit, supported by Burkina Faso's top cybersecurity experts, began combing through the files. What they uncovered would not only justify Morrison's arrest in the eyes of many but would also ignite an even larger firestorm. The evidence was damning. 10 years' worth of correspondence between World Bank officials and certain African political elites revealed a web of manipulation, bribery, and coercion. Detailed records showed how massive infrastructure loans were granted not for development, but for political loyalty. In some cases, development assistance was used as a front for buying influence during elections. Worse still were the plans hidden in confidential folders labeled contingency scenarios. These documents outlined potential support for regime change in countries deemed financially non-compliant, including suggestions for backing coups, destabilizing public movements, and funneling cash through intermediaries. There were lists, names of leaders, activists, journalists considered high risk to Western financial interests. There were recordings. Conversations between consultants and local operatives discussing neutralizing resistance through media disinformation or economic sabotage. There were even photos, meetings in foreign embassies, envelopes passed discreetly, handshakes captured in grainy images. President Traoré, upon reviewing the files, made a pivotal decision. Burkina Faso would not keep this information hidden. Instead, the government prepared a dossier and submitted it directly to the International Court of Justice, accompanied by a formal complaint alleging decades of economic war crimes against the people of Africa. In a televised address, Traoré declared, "This is not just about us. It is about every African nation whose future was sold behind closed doors. The truth is no longer buried. The documents are real. The crimes are real. And now the world must answer." The release of the files, dubbed the Morrison Papers, sparked global outrage. Whistleblowers came forward in other countries, confirming similar operations. Legal experts from South Africa, Kenya, and Egypt volunteered to support the case at The Hague. Even within Europe, dissident voices in parliaments demanded investigations into their government's complicity. Traoré hadn't just arrested a man. He had cracked open a vault of truth. And with it, came the undeniable proof that Africa's struggle wasn't rooted in poverty or mismanagement, but in decades of engineered exploitation. Burkina Faso was no longer just a name on a map, it had become a symbol. In city squares across Africa, people no longer spoke of Traoré as just a president. He was now called the Lion of Ouagadougou, the son of Sankara, the man who made the world listen. His face appeared on murals, in classroom posters, on T-shirts sold at street corners. But beyond the slogans and celebrations, something deeper had begun, a redefinition of power. For decades, Africa had been told it was too poor, too unstable, too dependent to stand alone. But now, a small landlocked nation had challenged the global financial order, and didn't blink. And perhaps most importantly, the people had responded not with fear, but with fire. A continent once dismissed as a pawn was beginning to move like a queen. The world watched in silence, then in shock, and finally in recognition. Even within the halls of Western power, voices began to rise. Lawmakers in Germany, Italy, and Spain called for a re-evaluation of the World Bank's practices. In Washington, debates erupted about the future of foreign aid. On Wall Street, analysts whispered about the Traore risk factor in Africa investments. The ripple effects were real, and they were growing. But as the dust settled, one truth stood above all else: Africa would never be the same. A new generation had witnessed what was possible when fear is replaced with clarity, when leaders choose courage over compromise. Across the continent, whispers of "who's next" became louder, more confident. In his final public address of the week, standing again before the roaring crowd in Sankara Square, Traore ended with just 3 words: "This is beginning." And indeed, it was. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Ask your leaders the hard questions. Because what happened in Burkina Faso wasn't a miracle. It was a choice. And the next one could be yours. In a dusty corner of Bamako, Mali, 68-year-old Mamadou Doumbia sat outside his small shop, a transistor radio buzzing beside him. As the news of Morrison's arrest played once more, he wiped a tear from his eye. "I never thought I would live to see this day," he said softly. "We've waited too long for someone to speak like Sankara did, for someone to make the world listen." Across the continent, that sentiment echoed in thousands of languages, in both quiet prayers and loud celebration. In Kenya, a group of university students gathered around their professor after class, still buzzing from a live stream of Traore's speech. "He said what our leaders are too afraid to say," one student remarked. "For the first time, I felt like someone spoke for me, not for donors." In Dakar, Senegal, street artist Ibrahima began painting a new mural, a roaring lion with Traore's eyes, surrounded by chains snapping into pieces. When asked why he was doing it, he smiled. "Because we're finally remembering who we are." The most powerful responses, though, came from those whose lives had been most affected by the very systems Traore defied. A cocoa farmer in Ivory Coast who had struggled for years under unstable export prices held a radio high above his head and shouted to his neighbors, "He said our gold is ours, why not our cocoa too?" A nurse in Accra, Ghana, who had worked for months without regular pay due to loan-based budget cuts, shared Traore's speech with her entire contact list. "He gave me hope," she wrote. "Hope that maybe we won't always be at the mercy of development loans that do nothing for our clinics." In the refugee camps of northern Nigeria, young men gathered around a shared phone, watching clips of the arrest over and over again. One of them, 19-year-old Ibrahim, said with conviction, "They always told us Africa was weak. But today, I saw strength. Today, I saw power." And in the diaspora, those born far from African soil but raised in its memory, something powerful was also stirring. In London, a second-generation Ghanaian woman posted a video of hers